Hi, and welcome to this online study of the book of Acts. For the next 6 weeks, we'll explore what happened after Jesus' death and resurrection. We'll be using Matthew Skinner's new book called Acts, Catching Up with the Spirit, as our guide. Dr. Skinner is a New Testament professor at Luther Seminary, and his area of scholarly research and expertise just happens to be the book of Acts. Skinner calls Acts one of the wildest books in the Bible. Take, for example, the story of Pentecost. The Spirit arrives with a rushing wind and tongues of flames, and then the Spirit inspires Peter to preach such a rousing sermon that 3,000 people join the Jesus movement. But the Spirit is just getting started in the book. Along the way, there will be dreams, shipwrecks, missionary journeys, and prison breaks. The church's biggest enemy will become one of its greatest apostles. Inspired and empowered by the Spirit, there will be witnesses who die for their faith, outsiders who ask to be baptized, and women who host house churches. We'll encounter some practices that seem a little strange to us, like speaking in tongues. And we'll discover that the early church had its share of conflict too. So buckle up and hold on as we try to catch up and keep up with the Spirit. Before we get started, I want to share some background information with you about the book of Acts. Acts is actually the second volume in a 2-volume work that scholars call Luke Acts. I know, what a creative title, right? I encourage you to read the first 4 verses of Luke and the first 2 verses of Acts to see why scholars say that these 2 books belong together. Right off the bat, Skinner notes that we have a translation issue to address when reading Acts. The New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which we typically use in worship, translates the last phrase of the opening verse this way: all that Jesus did and taught from the beginning. But Skinner notes that a better translation of the Greek would be all that Jesus began to do and teach. Why does this matter? Because what the book of Acts is trying to make clear is that although Jesus is no longer physically present in the world, his work and ministry continue. Jesus is just getting started. He is still present, but present now through the Spirit and in and through his followers, the church. And, of course, this work continues now through you and through me. The book's formal title is Acts of the Apostles. But what we're going to discover along the way is that the main character in the story is really the Spirit of the risen Christ. So a better title might be the Acts of the Spirit. It's also worth noting that without the book of Acts, there would be a gap in the New Testament. The Gospels end with the resurrection of Jesus and a few of his resurrection appearances. But Paul's letters pick up some 30 or 40 years later when Paul is already out founding churches. Acts connects the Gospels to the rest of the New Testament and helps us understand who Paul is, first of all, and how these churches that he is writing letters to came to be. One final thought. Skinner writes in the introduction, Acts describes episodes and people from the young church's history so that communities of believers near the end of the first century would know who they were. Acts tells stories so Christians would remember what God had called them to do and how God had been faithful so far. Of course, at the writing of his book, Skinner could not have known the situation we would currently find ourselves in. But I find his words helpful at this moment in time. Digging deeper into the story of Acts has been helpful for me. It is reassuring to me to be reminded of what God has done in the past, to be reminded of God's promises and God's faithfulness to those promises. It's also been comforting to me to remember and to feel a connection to a community that has been around for some 2,000 years. I am not, we are not, the first to have to figure out this thing called church. The church has been out there bearing witness to what God in Christ has done for millennia. God has seen the church through all kinds of situations, good and bad, and God will see us through this current crisis. My prayer is that as we make our way through the book of Acts together, we will be renewed in our sense of call and purpose as witnesses to Jesus Christ. I look forward to these next 6 weeks as we spend time together in Bible study as we explore the book of the Acts of the Apostles.